The fire had taken everything. Alara Whitlow could still smell the acrid smoke in her dreams, could still hear the screams of her mother as the flames consumed their small cottage on the outskirts of Eldergrove. She had been 12 years old then, standing in the snow with her younger brother clutched to her chest, watching the only home she had ever known collapse into ash and ember. Her father had died 2 winters before that, his body broken in the quarries where he had labored under the cruel oversight of Lord Vane's foreman. They said it was an accident. They always said it was an accident when a poor man died in service to the wealthy. Her mother had tried to keep them alive after that, taking in washing and mending, her fingers raw and bleeding from the lye soap and the endless scrubbing. But the coin was never enough, and the winters in the Mountain Kingdom were merciless. When the fire came, sparked by a neglected hearth in a moment of exhausted sleep, it had been swift and absolute. Alara's brother had survived only 3 days after that night, succumbing to the fever that ravaged his small, malnourished body. At 12 years old, Alara Whitlow had become an orphan, alone in a kingdom that had no mercy for the weak, the poor, or the broken. She was 22 now, and the years between had been a slow erosion of hope. She had survived by learning the herbs that grew in the shadowed places of the mountain forests, the plants that could ease pain or bring down a fever, the roots that could be sold for a few copper coins in the market square. She lived in a room barely larger than a closet, in a boarding house run by a widow who charged her twice what she charged others because Alara had no family, no protection, no one to speak for her. The other tenants whispered about her, called her cursed, said that death followed her like a shadow. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the universe had marked her from birth as one of its victims, destined to crawl through life on bloodied knees, never rising, never escaping. The kingdom of Eldergrove was ancient and beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. It sat nestled in the spine of the Blackthorn Mountains, its castle rising like a jagged tooth against the perpetual gray sky. The stones of the streets were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, the buildings leaning into each other as if exhausted by the weight of history. In the upper districts, where the nobles lived, there were gardens that bloomed even in winter, maintained by old magic and older money. But in the lower districts, where Alara dwelled, the streets ran with sewage and desperation. Children begged on corners with empty eyes. Women sold what they could: bread, flesh, hope, for enough coin to see another day. The King's Guard patrolled with hands on their sword hilts, quick to crack skulls and ask questions never. Alara had learned to make herself small, to move through the world like smoke, noticed by no one, threatening to no one. She kept her eyes down and her voice soft. She wore her faded brown cloak pulled tight around her thin frame, hiding the sharp angles of her shoulders, the hollow of her collarbone where hunger had carved its signature. Her hair, once a lustrous chestnut, now hung in a dull braid down her back, and her hands were perpetually stained with the green and brown of her trade. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the margins of a society that had no place for her. But even ghosts need to eat. And so, on the night that would change everything, Alara found herself walking through the narrow, twisting streets toward the night market, a pouch of herbs clutched in her trembling hands. The night market was illegal, of course. It existed in the spaces between law and chaos, appearing in different locations throughout the city according to a schedule known only to those desperate enough to seek it out. Here, things were traded that the daylight world refused to acknowledge: stolen goods, forbidden magics, information that could topple houses or save lives. And, it was whispered, creatures that should not exist outside of nightmares. Alara had avoided the night market for years, despite her poverty. There was something about it that made her skin crawl, some instinctive recognition of a boundary that should not be crossed. But winter was closing in again, and her herb stores were depleted, and the widow who owned her boarding house had made it clear that if the rent was not paid by week's end, Alara would find herself on the street. And on the streets of Eldergrove in winter, one did not survive long. So she had gathered what remained of her most potent herbs, wolfsbane, moonpetal, ghost root, and wrapped them carefully in oilcloth. and set out into the night with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The market had manifested tonight in the ruins of the old tannery district, where the buildings were hollow shells and the stench of old death still lingered in the stones. As Alara approached, she could see the flicker of lanterns through broken windows, could hear the murmur of voices and the clink of coin. She pulled her cloak tighter, took a breath that tasted of snow and smoke, and stepped through the sagging doorway into another world. The interior had been transformed. What should have been empty, crumbling space was now alive with activity. Stalls and tables lined the walls, laden with goods that gleamed and whispered in the dim light. Vendors called out their wares in voices that seemed to echo from somewhere other than their throats. Alara saw bottles of liquid that swirled with colors that had no names, saw daggers that wept blood without ever being drawn, saw mirrors that showed reflections of people who were not there. The crowd was a mix of the desperate and the dangerous, hooded figures who moved with predatory grace, merchants with eyes that reflected light like animals, and scattered among them, people like Alara, ordinary and terrified and out of options. She made her way through the press of bodies, her herbs clutched to her chest, searching for someone who might buy them. A woman with silver-threaded hair and fingers that ended in points rather than nails examined her wolfsbane with professional interest and offered her a handful of coppers that were barely enough for 3 days' rent. Alara negotiated with the desperation of the drowning and managed to extract a few additional coins. Enough perhaps for 5 days if she ate nothing but stale bread and water. It was as she was turning to leave, her transaction complete, and her small pouch of coins heavy with temporary salvation, that she heard the commotion at the far end of the market. Voices raised in excitement and fear, the crowd shifting, flowing towards something like water drawn by a drain. Alara should have left then, should have walked out into the night and returned to her cold room and counted herself fortunate to have survived the night market with her life and a bit of coin. But there was something in the sound of the crowd, something that pulled at her with hooks she did not understand. She followed. Against every instinct of self-preservation, she followed. The crowd had formed a rough circle around a raised platform that had been erected in what was once the tannery's main workspace. Torches burned at the four corners, casting wild, dancing shadows. And on the platform, chained and kneeling, was a man. No, not a man. Even from a distance, even with her limited understanding of the world beyond her small, painful existence, Alara knew that what knelt on that platform was something more and something other. He was enormous, his frame broad and heavily muscled, even in his bound kneeling position. His hair was black as a moonless night, falling in tangled waves around a face that was all hard plains and brutal beauty. But it was his eyes that arrested her, that stopped her breath in her chest. They were amber, burning with an inner light that seemed to illuminate the darkness around him. And they were filled with a rage and a sorrow so profound that Alara felt it like a physical blow. The chains that bound him were not ordinary iron. They gleamed with a sickly, greenish luminescence, covered in runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. Silver, Alara realized with a jolt of recognition drawn from old tales and older warnings. Silver, which could bind creatures that were more than human, and wrapping around the chains, growing through them like parasitic vines, were strands of something that looked like thorned wire, but that pulsed with a faint, nauseating light. Thornbind, the stories called it. A plant that grew only in the darkest parts of the Blackthorn Mountains, that fed on magic and pain. The man, the creature, the being on the platform was bleeding from where the thornbind had cut into his wrists and throat. The blood ran black in the torchlight, steaming faintly in the cold air. And yet he held himself with a terrible dignity, his back straight despite the pain that must have been coursing through him, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd, beyond the walls, beyond perhaps the world itself. "Gentlemen and ladies," a voice called out, slick and oily as a snake's belly, "I present to you the prize of the century, the fall of a king, the humbling of a god." The speaker was a man in rich robes, his face hidden behind a mask of silver that reflected the torchlight in blinding flashes. Before you kneels Ronan Theron, the so-called Alpha King of the Lycan clans. The terror of the Blackthorn, the beast who has ruled the Shadowlands for 15 years with fang and claw and merciless law. A ripple went through the crowd. Alara heard the gasps, the whispers, the low sounds of fear and fascination. The Alpha King. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Eldergrove had heard the stories. The Lycans were the old race, the first people who could shift between human and wolf at will, who lived in the deep forests and the high mountains, who answered to no human law and bowed to no human king. And Ronan Theron was their leader, had been since he was barely 14 years old, when he had killed his own father in ritual combat to claim the throne. They said he was merciless. They said he was savage. They said he had eyes like the sun and a heart like a stone, and that he had never known mercy or love or anything resembling human warmth. Looking at him now, chained and bleeding on a slaver's platform, Alara believed every terrible word. And yet, there was something in the set of his shoulders, something in the way he held his head high despite the humiliation, that spoke not of brutality, but of a strength so absolute that it did not need to boast, did not need to demonstrate. He was a king, even in chains, perhaps especially in chains. "How?" someone in the crowd called out. "Did you manage to capture him?" The masked auctioneer laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "With great difficulty and greater treachery, I assure you. It seems that even an Alpha King can be betrayed by those closest to him. His own council, his most trusted advisors, decided that 15 years of his rule was enough. They wanted a king who would be more amenable to certain arrangements with the human kingdoms, more willing to open the Lycan territories to trade and exploitation. Lord Malric Vane, specifically, has proven most cooperative in this endeavor." Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Lord Malric Vane. She knew that name. Everyone in the lower districts knew that name. He was the king's advisor, the power behind the throne of Eldergrove, the man who controlled the quarries and the mines and the trade routes. He was the man whose foreman had worked her father to death, the man whose policies had made sure that people like Alara stayed poor and powerless and desperate. And now, apparently, he was also a kingslayer, a betrayer of the old treaties, a man willing to chain a Lycan king and sell him like meat in a market. "The bidding," the auctioneer announced, "will start at 1,000 gold crowns." The sum was incomprehensible. Alara had never seen a gold crown in her life, had never even held a silver piece. 1,000 gold crowns could feed every person in the lower districts for a year. It could buy a house, a shop, a future. It was more wealth than Alara could imagine in a lifetime of imagining. The bids came fast and eager. Merchants and nobles, their faces hidden behind masks and hoods, calling out numbers that made Alara's head spin. 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. The price climbed and climbed, and on the platform, the Alpha King remained motionless, his eyes fixed on nothing, his face a mask of stone. And then, in a moment of silence, as one bid fell and before another could rise, those amber eyes shifted, moved, found Alara in the crowd as if drawn by some invisible thread, and locked onto her with the force of a physical impact. Time seemed to stop. The noise of the market faded to a distant roar. Alara could not breathe, could not move, could not look away. Those eyes were burning into her, through her, seeing things that she had hidden even from herself. And in them she saw, what? Recognition? Impossible. They had never met, could never have met. Her life and his existed in completely different worlds. And yet the sensation of being seen, truly seen, for perhaps the first time in her life was so powerful that Alara felt tears spring to her eyes. 4,000 gold crowns, a voice called, breaking the spell. The Alpha King's eyes released her, moving back to their distant focus. Alara staggered, gasping for air like she had been underwater. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing. What had just happened? What had she felt in that moment of connection? "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice." Alara's hand rose. She did not tell it to rise. She did not make a conscious decision. But it rose nonetheless, and her voice, Rusty, from disuse and hoarse with fear, called out, "I bid." The market fell silent. Every face turned toward her. The auctioneer's masked head tilted in what might have been confusion or amusement. "I'm sorry, miss. Did you say you wish to bid?" "Yes." The word came out stronger than she felt. "I bid." "And your offer?" Alara reached into her pouch with trembling fingers and pulled out every coin she had. The coppers she had just earned from selling her herbs, the few additional pieces she had hidden away for emergencies, everything she had in the world. "I bid this." She held out her hand. In her palm lay perhaps 2 silver pieces worth of copper and small silver coins. In the torchlight, they looked like what they were, the pathetic scraps of a desperate poor woman. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and sharp, but the auctioneer did not laugh. He stood very still for a moment, and then he tilted his head toward the platform where the Alpha King knelt, and Alara followed his gaze. Ronan Theron was staring at her again, but this time, there was something different in his eyes, not just recognition, but wonder, and, incredibly, a faint curve at the corner of his mouth that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Sold," the auctioneer said softly. To the young woman in the brown cloak, the market erupted in outrage. Voices shouted protests, demanded explanations, called for the bid to be revoked. But the auctioneer held up a hand, and somehow, impossibly, silence fell. "The rules of the night market are ancient and absolute," he said, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Any bid freely made must be accepted if it represents all that the bidder possesses. This woman has offered everything she has. By law and custom, the merchandise is hers." Alara could not believe what she was hearing, could not process what had just happened. She had bid everything she owned, which was almost nothing, and somehow, impossibly, she had won. She had purchased a king. She had bought the alpha of the Lycan clans with 2 silver pieces worth of copper. "Come," the auctioneer said, gesturing to her. "Claim your property." Alara's legs moved without her permission, carrying her forward through the parting crowd. She climbed the steps to the platform on legs that felt like water, approached the kneeling figure of Ronan Theron, with her heart thundering so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. Even kneeling, his head was nearly level with hers. The wounds from the thornbind were deeper than she had realized, the blood flowing freely, and she could see the tremors in his muscles that spoke of pain held rigidly in check. The auctioneer pressed a key into her hand. "The chains will release to your touch now," he said. "You own him, body and soul, until you choose to free him, or until he dies. Such are the terms of the binding." Alara looked at the key, then at the chains, then at the man who wore them. His amber eyes met hers, and this time she did not look away. "I'm going to unlock these," she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. "And then we're going to walk out of here. Can you stand?" A single small nod. Alara inserted the key into the first lock. It turned with a click that sounded like the breaking of worlds. The chains fell away from his wrists, hitting the platform with a sound like thunder. She unlocked the collar at his throat, and as it fell, she saw the raw, bloody wounds it had left, saw the way his hands came up to touch his neck as if he could not quite believe he was free. He rose then, unfolding to his full height, and Alara had to crane her neck back to look at him. He was massive, easily a head and a half taller than her, his presence filling the platform, filling the market, filling the world. For a moment, she was terrified. For a moment, she was certain she had made the worst mistake of her life, that he would tear her apart with his bare hands, that she would die here in this terrible place and no one would even remember her name. But instead he held out his hand to her, a hand that was scarred and strong and still bleeding from where the chains had cut into his wrist. "Come," he said, and his voice was like gravel and honey, rough and deep and surprisingly gentle. "We leave. Now." Alara placed her small, stained, trembling hand in his, and together they walked off the platform and through the crowd. No one tried to stop them. No one dared. The Alpha King of the Lycans was free, and he walked beside a poor herbalist girl with her hand in his, and something in the air itself seemed to shift and change. as if the world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. They emerged from the ruins of the tannery into the cold, clear night. Above them, the stars burned like ice in a black sky. The sounds of the night market faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through abandoned buildings. Ronan Theron stopped walking and turned to face Alara, still holding her hand, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked finally. Alara shook her head, mute with fear and confusion, and a strange, wild hope that she did not understand. "You've saved my life," he said. "You've freed a king, and you've bound yourself to me in ways that you cannot begin to comprehend." He lifted their joined hands, turned her palm upward. In the starlight, she could see a mark there that had not been there before, a silver spiral, faintly glowing, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "Do you feel it?" he whispered. "The bond? The pull?" And Alara realized that she did, that from the moment their eyes had met in the market, something had been growing between them. Some connection that was not physical, but was no less real for that. She could feel him somehow, like an extension of her own self. Could feel his pain and his rage and, beneath all of that, a terrible aching loneliness that matched her own. "What is it?" she breathed. "The fated bond," he said. "The mate bond. The one connection that a lichen can never choose, never refuse, never escape. You are mine, Alara Whitlow, and I am yours. For as long as we both live." He said her name. He knew her name, though she had never spoken it. And looking up into those amber eyes, seeing her reflection there, Alara understood that her life had just changed in ways that she could not begin to imagine. She had walked into the night market a poor, forgotten orphan, with nothing but herbs and desperation. She was walking out of it bound to a king, marked by fate, with a future that suddenly stretched before her like a vast, unexplored country. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You will," he said. "Come. We must leave this city before Vane discovers what has happened. Before his hunters find us." He paused, and something that might have been a smile touched his brutal, beautiful face. "You saved my life tonight, little Omega. Now let me save yours. Let me take you somewhere safe. Let me show you what it means to be the mate of an Alpha King." And because she had no other choice, because the old life was gone and a new one was being offered, because something in her responded to him with a certainty that defied all logic, Alara nodded. Together, they disappeared into the labyrinth of Eldergrove's dark streets, leaving behind the night market and the old world and everything Alara had ever known. Above them, the moon emerged from behind the clouds, full and bright, and for a moment, Alara could have sworn she saw the shape of a wolf outlined against its silver face. Part 2. They moved through the city like shadows fleeing the dawn. Ronan led the way, his hand still gripping Alara's, pulling her through alleys she had never known existed, across rooftops that groaned under their weight, down into the sewers where the darkness was absolute, and the stench was overwhelming. Alara's lungs burned with the effort of keeping pace with him, her thin legs struggling to match his long stride. But he never slowed, never looked back, never released her hand. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of pursuit beginning. Shouts in the distance, the baying of hounds, the clash of weapons and the thunder of boots on stone. Vane's men, she realized. The King's Guard. They had discovered what had happened at the night market, and they were hunting. Hunting a king who had escaped their trap. Hunting a girl who had dared to free him. "Where are we going?" Alara gasped as they emerged from a drain pipe into a section of the city she did not recognize. Warehouses loomed around them, their windows dark and empty as dead eyes. "Out," Ronan said shortly. "Beyond the walls. Into the Blackthorn. The Blackthorn Mountains. The wild lands. The territory where humans did not venture unless they wished to disappear forever." Alara had never left Eldergrove in her life, had never even approached the great walls that ringed the city. The world beyond was a place of stories and nightmares, of wolves and worse things, of magic that could tear a person apart or transform them into something unrecognizable. "I can't," she said, pulling against his grip for the first time. "I can't go there. I'll die." He stopped then, turning to face her, and in the moonlight, his eyes seemed to glow with their own internal fire. "You will die if you stay," he said, his voice hard but not unkind. "Do you think Vayne will allow you to live after what you've done? Do you think he will see you as anything other than a threat? A witness? A loose end to be tied off? You freed me, Alara. You humiliated him and his allies in front of the entire night market. He will hunt you down and he will kill you, and it will not be quick or merciful." Alara felt the words like blows, felt the truth of them settling into her bones. She had not thought beyond the moment, had not considered consequences. She had acted on instinct, on some impulse she still did not understand. And now she was bound to this man, this creature, this king who was dragging her into a world she was not prepared for. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did I do it? Why did I bid for you?" Ronan's expression softened slightly, and he reached up with his free hand to touch the mark on her palm, the silver spiral that still pulsed with faint light. "The bond," he said. "It called to you. Your soul recognized mine even before your mind could comprehend what was happening. This is not something that can be explained or rationalized, little Omega. This simply is. And now we must live with the consequences of fate's choice." Before Alara could respond, the sound of the hounds grew suddenly louder, closer. Ronan's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. "They're tracking us," he said. "Bloodhounds. They have my scent from the chains, from the blood I left on the platform." He looked down at himself, at the wounds that still wept black blood down his arms and throat. "I'm leaving a trail they can follow." "Then we have to stop the bleeding," Alara said, her mind suddenly clicking into the familiar patterns of her work. She might not understand fate or bonds or lichen kings, but she understood wounds. She understood how to heal. "We need to find shelter. Somewhere I can treat your injuries." Ronan shook his head. "There's no time. We have to reach the wall, get beyond it before— You'll collapse before we reach the wall if you keep losing blood at this rate," Alara interrupted, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I can see you shaking. I can see how much pain you're in. The thornbind poison is still in your system, isn't it? It's weakening you, slowing your healing." For a moment, Ronan simply stared at her, and Alara wondered if she had overstepped, if she had angered him, if he would simply leave her here and save himself. But then, incredibly, he smiled. A real smile this time, not just a ghost of one, and it transformed his face from brutal to something approaching beautiful. "You're right," he said. "The thornbind is poison to my kind. It will kill me eventually if it's not purged." He looked around, his eyes scanning the warehouses. "There, that building. The door is broken. We can shelter there long enough for you to work." They ran for the warehouse, slipping through the gap in the door just as the sound of the hounds rounded the corner behind them. Inside, the darkness was complete, broken only by thin streams of moonlight filtering through holes in the roof. The space smelled of old grain and rat droppings and abandonment. Ronan led her to the far corner, the farthest point from the door, and lowered himself to the ground with a groan he could not quite suppress. "Tell me what you need," he said through gritted teeth. Alara knelt beside him, her hands already assessing his wounds in the dim light. The cuts from the silver chains were deep, but it was the punctures from the thornbind that worried her most. She could see the dark veins spreading from each wound, could see the way his skin had taken on a grayish tint around them. Poison, moving slowly but inexorably through his system. "I need light," she said. "I need water. I need—" She trailed off, realizing that she had nothing. Her herbs were sold. Her tools were back in her room. She had only the clothes on her back and empty hands. "Here." Ronan reached up and tore a strip of fabric from his already tattered shirt. "Use this for bandages." He pressed his palm flat against the ground, and Alara watched in amazement as a faint glow began to emanate from his skin, spreading across the floor in threads of golden light that illuminated the space around them. "That's the best I can do for light. As for water?" He gestured toward a corner where she could see the shape of an old rain barrel. Alara moved quickly, checking the barrel and finding it half full of stagnant but usable water. She tore more strips from the hem of her own dress, soaked them in the water, and returned to Ronan's side. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. "Everything hurts," he replied with a dark humor. "Do what you must." Alara began to clean the wounds, her fingers as gentle as she could make them, washing away the dried blood and the poison that oozed from the thornbind punctures. Ronan remained still as stone, but she could feel the tremors running through his massive frame, could hear the sharp intake of his breath when she touched the deepest cuts. The silver burns were the worst, blistered and raw, refusing to heal with the supernatural speed that should have been his birthright. "Talk to me," Ronan said suddenly, his voice strained. "Distract me from this. Tell me about yourself, Alara Whitlow. Tell me how a poor herbalist girl ended up in the night market with enough courage to bid for a king." Alara continued her work, pressing clean cloth against a particularly deep wound on his wrist. "There's not much to tell," she said quietly. "I'm no one. I've always been no one." "That's not true." His eyes, even dimmed by pain, were intent on her face. "No one who was no one could have done what you did tonight. The night market is not a place for the faint of heart. Most would have fled screaming from what they saw there. But you stayed. You watched. And when the moment came, you acted. Why?" Alara shook her head, struggling to find words for something she barely understood herself. "I don't know. When I saw you on that platform, when I saw what they had done to you, I felt something I've never felt before. It was like seeing myself reflected in a mirror I didn't know existed. You were chained and humiliated and bleeding, and everyone was laughing or bidding on you like you were a piece of meat, and all I could think was, that's wrong. That's so profoundly wrong. And I couldn't just walk away and let it continue. Even though I'm a monster?" Ronan's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Even though everything you've heard about me is true, I have killed Alara. I have torn apart my enemies with teeth and claws. I have ruled with an iron fist and shown no mercy to those who challenged me. I am not a good man. I am barely a man at all." Alara paused in her work, meeting his eyes directly. "I don't know if you're a good man or a bad man," she said. "I don't know anything about you except what I saw tonight. But what I saw was someone who held on to their dignity even when everything else was stripped away. Someone who looked at their captors without fear. Someone who—" She hesitated, then continued. "Someone whose eyes held the same kind of loneliness I see in my own mirror every morning." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant baying of the hounds and the drip of water somewhere in the warehouse. Ronan's hand came up slowly, carefully, and his fingers brushed against her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and dangerous. "You see too much, little Omega," he whispered. "You see right through to the core of me." Alara felt heat rise to her face at his touch, felt that strange pull intensify, the bond he had spoken of humming between them like a plucked string. She forced herself to focus, to return her attention to his wounds. She had cleaned them as best she could, but the thornbind poison was still there, still spreading. She needed something to draw it out, something to counteract its effects. "Ghost root," she said suddenly. "If I had ghost root, I could make a poultice that would draw out the poison. It grows in places like this, in the dark corners, feeding on decay." She stood, scanning the warehouse floor, her eyes adjusting to the golden glow that Ronan was still emanating. There, in the far corner, where the roof had collapsed and let in rain and rot, she saw it. The pale, luminescent leaves of ghost root, growing in a cluster around a fallen beam. She hurried over, carefully harvesting the plant, murmuring the old words her mother had taught her, the thanks that should be given to growing things when you took their life for healing. She returned to Ronan and began to crush the leaves between her palms, mixing them with water from her soaked bandages until she had a thick, greenish paste. "This will burn," she warned. "Worse than the cleaning did. The ghost root has to kill the thornbind poison, and it does that by burning it out." "Do it," Ronan said, and there was something like respect in his voice. "You know your craft, herbalist. I trust you." Trust. The word struck Alara with unexpected force. No one had trusted her in so long. No one had looked at her with anything other than suspicion or contempt, or, at best, indifference. And now this man, this king. This creature who had every reason to doubt her, to question her motives, was placing his life in her hands with complete faith. She applied the poultice to each of the thornbind punctures, and Ronan's reaction was immediate and visceral. His entire body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists, a sound that was almost a growl tearing from his throat. But he did not pull away, did not stop her. He endured. And as she worked, Alara could see the dark veins beginning to recede, could see color returning to his skin around the wounds. "It's working," she breathed. "The poison is being drawn out." Ronan's response was a grunt that might have been agreement, or might have been suppressed agony. Alara worked as quickly as she dared, treating each wound, binding them with the torn fabric, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of years of solitary study and desperate need. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Thank you," Ronan said, his voice hoarse but stronger than before. "You may have just saved my life for the second time tonight. Don't thank me yet," Alara replied. "We still have to get out of the city. We still have to survive whatever comes next." As if in response to her words, the sound of the hounds suddenly intensified, and she heard voices shouting, closer than before. "Search every building! The Alpha King can't have gone far, not in his condition. And find the girl. Lord Vane wants her alive." Alive, Alara thought with a chill. That was almost worse than wanting her dead. Alive meant interrogation, meant torture, meant being used as bait or leverage. She looked at Ronan and saw the same understanding in his eyes. "Can you stand?" she asked. In answer, he pushed himself to his feet, moving more easily than he had before, the healing already beginning to take effect now that the poison was being purged. He was still wounded, still weak by his standards, but he was no longer actively dying. "We go now," he said. "Out the back. There's always a back way in places like this." He led her through the warehouse to a small loading door that had been boarded over, but that he tore apart with casual strength that made Alara's eyes widen. They emerged into an alley that ran along the outer wall of the city, and Alara could see the massive stone fortification rising above them, seemingly insurmountable. "How do we get over that?" she asked, staring up at the wall that was at least 30 feet high, smooth stone with no handholds, patrolled by guards whose torches she could see moving in the darkness above. Ronan's smile was sharp and dangerous. "We don't go over it. We go through it." He moved along the base of the wall, his fingers trailing over the stone, until he found what he was looking for, a section where the mortar had crumbled with age, where the stones were loose. "The Lycans built these walls," he said. "Built them centuries ago, before humans came to Eldergrove. And we always leave ourselves a way in and out of any place we build. A secret way. A way known only to those with the blood and the knowledge." He pressed his palm against a specific stone, and Alara watched in amazement as runes began to glow beneath his touch, ancient symbols that crawled across the surface of the wall like living things. With a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the night, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a passage that led down into darkness. "Come," Ronan said, holding out his hand once more. Alara looked at that hand, scarred and strong, still marked with her bandages. She looked at the passage, leading down into the unknown. She looked back over her shoulder at the city where she had lived her entire life, where she had suffered and survived and existed in the margins. There was nothing for her there. There never had been. Only pain and poverty and a slow death by degrees. She took his hand. Together they descended into the passage, and behind them, the wall sealed shut with a final rumble of stone on stone. The darkness was absolute, but Ronan's hand in hers was warm and solid and certain. She could hear water dripping, could smell earth and age, and something wild and green that spoke of the forest beyond. "These tunnels run beneath the wall and out into the Blackthorn," Ronan's voice came from the darkness ahead of her. "They'll emerge about a mile outside the city, in a clearing that my people use when we need to move unseen. From there, we'll travel through the forest to Blackstone Keep. It's a 2-day journey on foot, longer if we have to avoid Vane's hunting parties." "Blackstone Keep," Alara repeated. "Your home?" My fortress. The seat of my power, what remains of it. It's where my father ruled before me, and his father before him, back through the generations to the first Alpha King. It's the heart of Lycan territory, and it's the only place in this world where you'll be truly safe from Vayne and his schemes. They walked in silence for a while, the passage sloping steadily downward and then up again, following the contours of the mountain beneath the city. Ilara's mind was reeling with everything that had happened, everything that had changed in the span of a few hours. This morning, she had woken in her cold room with nothing but the prospect of selling herbs to make rent. Now she was walking through secret tunnels beneath the city wall, bound by fate to a Lycan king, fleeing into the wilderness with hunters at her heels. What happens now? She asked finally. I mean, what happens with this? She gestured vaguely between them, knowing he would understand she meant the bond, the connection that she could still feel thrumming beneath her skin. Ronan was quiet for a long moment before answering. I don't know, he admitted, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that surprised her. The mate bond is not something I ever expected to experience. Lycans can go their entire lives without finding their fated mate. Most of us marry for politics or convenience, or simply because we desire companionship. But the true bond, the one that fate forges between souls, that's rare, precious, and complicated beyond measure. Complicated how? Because it cannot be refused or broken, because it ties two lives together in ways that transcend choice or desire. You did not ask for this, Ilara. You did not consent to be bound to a monster king, to be dragged into a war that is not your own, to have your life upended and changed forever. And yet here you are, marked by me, claimed by fate, with no way to undo what has been done. Ilara thought about that, about the unfairness of it, about how her entire life had been shaped by forces beyond her control. She had not chosen to be born poor, had not chosen to be orphaned, had not chosen the countless humiliations and hardships that had defined her existence. And now, once again, she was being carried along by currents she did not understand, toward a destination she had not selected. And yet, I could have walked away, she said quietly. At the night market, I could have sold my herbs and left without ever approaching that platform. No one forced me to bid for you. No one compelled me to unlock your chains. Maybe the bond was pulling at me. Maybe fate was guiding my hand. But in the end, I chose. I made a decision. And I'm still here, still holding your hand, still following you into the darkness. That has to count for something. She felt rather than saw Ronan turn to look at her in the darkness. You are extraordinary, he said softly. You are the strongest person I have ever met, and you don't even know it yet. Before Ilara could respond to that, before she could process the warmth that spread through her chest at his words, they reached the end of the tunnel. A faint glimmer of moonlight filtered down from above, and Ronan led her up a set of carved stone steps to a concealed exit that opened into the forest, the Blackthorn Forest. Ilara stepped out into a world transformed. The city had been all hard edges and harsh angles, stone and smoke, and the smell of human misery. But here, the air was clean and sharp with the scent of pine and earth. Above them, trees rose like cathedral pillars, their branches weaving together to create a canopy that filtered the moonlight into a silver lacework on the forest floor. Everything was alive, breathing, growing. She could hear the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through needles and leaves. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. Stay close to me, Ronan said, his voice taking on a new note of authority. The Blackthorn is my home, but it's also wild and dangerous to those who don't know its ways. There are things that hunt here, things that would see you as prey. And there are also Vayne's men, who will be watching the roads and the known paths. Then how do we travel? Ronan's smile was sharp and wild. We travel as the Lycans travel, through the deep woods, where only those with our blood can walk safely. He looked down at her, and his eyes seemed to glow brighter in the darkness of the forest. I'm going to need to carry you for part of this journey, in my other form. Are you prepared for that? His other form, the wolf, the beast that lived inside him, that was as much a part of him as his human shape. Alara felt fear spike through her, but she pushed it down, nodded. "I'm prepared." "Then hold on to me," Ronan said. "And whatever you see, whatever happens, trust that I will not let you fall." He stepped away from her, and in the moonlight, Alara watched as he began to change. It was not the grotesque transformation of horror stories, bones breaking and reshaping with screams of agony. It was fluid, almost beautiful, like watching water flow into a new container. His form rippled and shifted, growing larger, reshaping itself with a sound like wind through grass. Where a man had stood, now crouched a wolf. But calling it a wolf was like calling the ocean a puddle. This creature was massive, easily as tall at the shoulder as Alara's chest, with fur that was black as midnight, and eyes that burned with that same amber fire. Power radiated from every line of its body, from the muscles that bunched beneath its pelt to the claws that dug into the earth. This was a predator, an apex being, something that had ruled the wild places since before humans had learned to make fire. And yet, when it looked at Alara, when those amber eyes met hers, she saw him, saw Ronan, saw the being she was bound to, recognizable regardless of the shape he wore. The great wolf lowered itself to the ground, an invitation clear in the gesture. Alara approached slowly, her heart hammering but her feet steady. She placed her hand on the thick fur of its shoulder, marveling at the warmth, the solidity, the sense of coiled strength waiting to be unleashed. Then, awkwardly, she climbed onto its back, her legs gripping its sides, her hands tangling in the fur at its neck. The wolf rose, smooth and steady, and Alara felt the world shift, felt herself seated atop a creature of myth and legend. For a moment, they remained still, and she could feel the connection between them, the bond that linked her small human heart to this wild, powerful being. Then the wolf began to run. The forest became a blur of shadow and silver. They moved between the trees with impossible speed and grace, the wolf's feet seeming to barely touch the ground. Wind tore at Alara's hair and clothes, stole the breath from her lungs, but she held on with all her strength, trusting as Ronan had asked her to trust. She could hear the forest alive around them, could sense other creatures scattering before the Alpha King's passage. They ran for what might have been hours, or might have been minutes. Time seemed to lose meaning in the wild rush of movement, in the rhythm of the wolf's stride, in the thrum of the bond between them. And slowly, gradually, Alara's fear began to transform into something else. Exhilaration, joy, freedom. She had spent her entire life constrained, confined, trapped in a city that had no place for her, trapped in a life that offered no escape. But here, now, running through the forest on the back of a Lycan king, she felt chains she hadn't even known she wore beginning to fall away. She felt alive in a way she had never experienced before. When the wolf finally slowed, finally came to a stop in a clearing where a spring bubbled up from between the rocks, Alara slid from its back on legs that trembled with exhaustion and emotion. She watched as the wolf shimmered and shifted, flowing back into the shape of a man. And Ronan stood before her once more, breathing hard, his eyes bright with the same exhilaration she felt. "Welcome," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "to freedom." And standing there in that moonlit clearing, with the wild forest around them and the bond singing between them, Alara believed him. For the first time in her life, she believed that freedom might actually be possible. Part 3. They rested by the spring only long enough for Alara to wash her face and hands, to drink deeply of water that tasted of stone and earth, and something indefinably wild. Ronan kept watch, his posture alert despite the exhaustion that must have been weighing on him. Every few minutes his head would turn, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air, reading messages in the wind that Alara could not begin to interpret. "Are they following us?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. Her thin dress and cloak, adequate in the city, were proving woefully insufficient in the mountain forest, where the night air bit with teeth of ice. "Not yet," Ronan replied, "but they will be. Vayne is not a man who accepts defeat easily." and he has resources I can no longer match. He controls the King's Guard, has alliances with half the noble houses in Eldergrove, and access to trackers and hunters who know these woods nearly as well as my own people. He glanced at her, noting her shivering. "You're cold." "I'm fine," Ilara lied, her teeth chattering slightly. Ronan made a sound that might have been amusement or exasperation. He shrugged out of the tattered remains of his shirt, the one she had torn strips from for bandages, and held it out to her. "It's not much, but it will provide some warmth." Ilara wanted to refuse, to insist that he needed it more than she did. But the practical part of her, the part that had survived 22 years of hardship, knew better than to reject help when it was offered. She took the shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was enormous on her, hanging nearly to her knees, and it carried his scent. Pine and smoke and something musky and masculine that made her pulse quicken in ways she tried not to examine too closely. "Thank you," she said quietly. They set out again, this time with Ronan in his human form, leading her by the hand through the forest. The terrain was rough, rising steadily as they climbed deeper into the mountains. Ilara's feet, clad only in thin cloth shoes meant for city cobblestones, were soon blistered and bleeding. But she did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaining changed nothing, that pain was simply something to be endured until it passed or killed you. But Ronan noticed. Of course he noticed. He was too observant, too attuned to her through the bond they shared. He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "You're hurt. It's nothing. We need to keep moving." "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a fallen log beside the path they were following. "Ronan, we don't have time. Sit." His voice carried the weight of authority, the tone of a king who was accustomed to being obeyed. And despite herself, despite her instinct to argue, Ilara found herself sitting. Ronan knelt before her, his large hands gentle as he lifted one of her feet and examined the damage. His expression darkened as he saw the blisters, the torn skin, the blood staining her shoes. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was rough with something that might have been anger or concern or both. "Because it doesn't matter," Ilara said. "Because we need to keep moving, and stopping to tend to my feet won't change anything except waste time we don't have." "It matters to me." He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw an intensity that stole her breath. "You matter to me, Ilara. Your pain matters. Your well-being matters. Do you understand that?" No one had said anything like that to her in 10 years. No one had cared about her pain, her well-being, her existence beyond what use she could provide. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, and to her horror, she felt tears prickling at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry, refusing to be weak. Ronan's hands were still cradling her foot, his touch impossibly gentle for someone so large and dangerous. "I'm going to carry you the rest of the way," he said. "We'll move faster that way anyway, and your feet need time to heal." "You're still recovering from your own wounds," Ilara protested. "The silver, the thornbind poison, is being purged even now, thanks to your skill." He stood, and before she could argue further, he swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "I am an Alpha King, Little Omega. I have carried wounded warriors twice your size through miles of hostile territory. You are not a burden to me. You could never be a burden to me." Ilara wanted to protest, wanted to insist on walking on her own feet despite the pain. But the truth was that being carried in his arms, pressed against the warmth of his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, was perhaps the safest she had felt in her entire life. So she allowed herself this weakness, this moment of surrender, and rested her head against his shoulder as he began to walk again. They traveled through the night and into the gray dawn that filtered through the canopy above. Ronan moved tirelessly, his stride never faltering, navigating the forest with an ease that spoke of decades of familiarity. Occasionally, he would pause, his head tilting as he listened to sounds Ilara could not hear, scenting threats she could not detect. But each time, he would resume his journey, apparently satisfied that they were not yet in immediate danger. As the sun climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew larger, more ancient, their trunks so wide that 10 men could not have linked hands around them. The undergrowth became less dense, giving way to soft moss and ferns that carpeted the forest floor in shades of green so vibrant they almost seemed to glow. And everywhere, Alara began to notice signs of habitation, marks carved into tree trunks, clearings that were too perfect to be natural, paths worn smooth by countless feet. "We're entering lichen territory now," Ronan said, his voice pitched low. "True lichen territory, the heart of the Blackthorn. From here on, we're under the protection of the old laws. Vane's men cannot follow without declaring war on my people. Will that stop him?" Alara asked. Ronan's smile was grim. "No, but it will make him more cautious, force him to move carefully. And it gives us time to reach Blackstone Keep and rally what forces remain loyal to me." The morning wore on, and Alara found herself drowsing in Ronan's arms, lulled by the rhythm of his movement and the exhaustion of the night's flight. She drifted in and out of sleep, dreams mixing with reality, until she was no longer certain what was real and what was memory. She dreamed of fire and smoke, of her mother's screams and her brother's cold body. She dreamed of the night market, of amber eyes finding hers across an impossible distance. She dreamed of running through the forest, but in the dream, she was the wolf, powerful and free, with Ronan running beside her as a man. She woke to the sound of voices. Her eyes snapped open, her body tensing, but Ronan's arms tightened around her reassuringly. "Easy," he murmured. "These are friends." "Well, allies at least." Alara looked around and realized they had entered a settlement of sorts. Structures were built among the trees, some in the branches high above, others nestled between the roots of the ancient trunks. They were not like the buildings of Eldergrove, no stone or brick or mortar. Instead, they seemed to have been grown rather than built. Wood and living tree shaped into dwelling places that were part of the forest itself. And everywhere, there were lichens. Alara could tell immediately that these were not human, even those who walked on two legs in human form. There was something in the way they moved, fluid and predatory, something in their eyes, which reflected light like animals, something in the very air around them, a sense of contained power, of wildness barely leashed. They were staring at her, all of them, dozens of eyes, gold and amber and green, fixed on the human woman in their Alpha King's arms. Alara felt her heart begin to race, felt the instinctive fear of prey in the presence of predators. But she forced herself to remain still, to meet their stares with as much dignity as she could muster. A figure detached itself from the crowd and approached them. It was a woman, or at least wore a woman's form, tall and lean with silver hair that fell in a long braid down her back. Her eyes were the pale gold of winter sunlight, and her face was lined with age and wisdom and something harder, something that spoke of battles fought and survived. "Ronan," she said, her voice carrying a note of relief and reproach in equal measure. "So the rumors are true. You live. We heard whispers that you had been taken, sold at the night market like common livestock. We heard that Vane had betrayed you to your enemies. And yet, here you stand, free and whole, with a human in your arms." Her eyes shifted to Alara, assessing, calculating. "A human who bears your mark. Senna," Ronan acknowledged with a nod of respect. "It's good to see you, old friend. Yes, I was betrayed. Yes, I was taken. And yes, this human freed me at great cost to herself. Her name is Alara Whitlow, and she is my fated mate." The words fell into the clearing like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled lichens. Alara heard the murmurs, saw the looks of disbelief and, in some cases, anger. A human. The Alpha King's fated mate was human. Senna's expression did not change, but Alara saw something flicker in those pale gold eyes. "Your mate," she repeated slowly. "A human Omega. Well, that is unexpected. Fate rarely consults our expectations," Ronan said dryly. He set Alara on her feet but kept one arm around her waist, supporting her weight off her injured feet. "I need shelter for her and healing for her wounds. I need information about Vane's movements and the state of the council. and I need to know who among our people remains loyal." Senna's gaze moved from Ronan to Alara and back again, and then she nodded sharply. "Come, we will speak privately, and your mate will be tended to." She turned and called out a name in a language that was not quite words, more like a series of growls and rhythmic sounds that nevertheless conveyed clear meaning. A younger Lycan appeared, a girl who looked to be perhaps 16 in human years, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes like chips of green glass. She approached cautiously, her gaze fixed on Alara with undisguised curiosity. "Kira will take Alara to the healing house," Senna said. "She will be safe there, and her injuries will be treated." Ronan's arm tightened around Alara's waist, and she felt the reluctance in him, the instinctive unwillingness to let her out of his sight. But after a moment, he nodded. "Go with Kira," he told Alara quietly. "I won't be far. If you need me, if anything frightens you or threatens you, just call out. I will hear you, and I will come." Alara looked up at him, saw the concern in his eyes, the protectiveness that was already becoming familiar. She wanted to tell him she would be fine, that she had survived far worse than the curiosity of a Lycan settlement, but the words stuck in her throat, because the truth was she was terrified. Terrified of being separated from him, of being alone among these creatures who looked at her like she was either a threat or a mistake, or both. But she nodded, forcing strength into her voice. "I'll be fine. Go. Do what you need to do." Ronan's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture that was startlingly intimate. "I will come for you soon," he promised. Then he released her and turned to follow Senna deeper into the settlement. Alara watched him go, feeling the bond between them stretch but not break, a thin silver thread connecting them even across distance. Then the girl, Kira, touched her arm gently, and Alara turned to follow her. The healing house was one of the structures built into the roots of a massive tree, its entrance a rounded doorway that seemed to have been shaped by hands or claws into smooth, organic curves. Inside, it was larger than it appeared from the outside, with multiple rooms branching off from a central space where a fire burned in a stone hearth. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars and bundles of herbs, and the air smelled of sage and pine and something medicinal that Alara could not quite identify. Kira led her to a low bench covered in soft furs and indicated she should sit. "I'll get water for washing," the girl said, her voice soft and lilting, carrying an accent that made the words sound like music. "And Healer Marin will be here soon to see to your feet." She disappeared through one of the doorways, leaving Alara alone in the healing house. Alara sat carefully, her body aching from the long night and the exhaustion that was finally catching up with her. She looked around the space, noting the careful organization, the cleanliness, the sense of a place where healing was not just practiced but revered. It reminded her of her own small room in Eldergrove, where she had kept her herbs and tools, where she had mixed her remedies and tried to ease suffering where she could. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now, like a story she had heard once, but could no longer quite remember the details of. So much had changed in such a short time. Yesterday she had been Alara Whitlow, poor herbalist, invisible and alone. Today she was... what? The Alpha King's fated mate. A human bound to a Lycan. A woman with a mark on her palm that pulsed with silver light, and a connection to a man who could become a wolf, and who looked at her like she was something precious. The door opened, and a woman entered. She was older than Senna, her face deeply lined, her hair completely white, and bound in a complex series of braids that wound around her head like a crown. But her eyes were sharp and clear, a deep brown that seemed to see through skin and bone to the truth beneath. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her worth, who had earned her place through years of skill and service. "So," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle for someone who looked so formidable, "you are the human who has captured our king's heart." She moved closer, her eyes examining Alara with professional interest. "I am Marin, healer to this clan. Let me see these feet that have carried you so far." Alara extended her feet, watching as Marin knelt and carefully removed her ruined shoes. The healer made a soft sound of sympathy as she examined the blisters and torn skin. "You have walked a long way on feet not meant for such travel," she observed. "And yet you did not complain, did not ask to stop. There is strength in you, child, even if your body is fragile." "I'm not fragile," Alara said, more sharply than she intended. "I've survived things that would have broken stronger people. I may be human, but I'm not weak." Marin's eyes lifted to meet hers, and there was approval in that gaze. "No," she agreed. "You are not weak. Fragile is not the same as weak. A bird's bone is fragile, but it can carry the bird across continents. Your body is fragile compared to ours, but your spirit," she smiled slightly. "Your spirit has the strength of steel, I think. Ronan has chosen well, whether fate guided his heart or not." Kira returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloths, and Marin set to work cleaning and treating Alara's feet. Her touch was skilled and gentle, and she mixed a poultice from herbs that Alara recognized, and some she did not. As she worked, she spoke in a low conversational tone that seemed designed to put Alara at ease. "You must understand," Marin said, "that you have entered into a complicated situation. Ronan is not just a king. He is the Alpha, the leader of all Lycan clans in the Blackthorn. His power, his authority, comes not just from his bloodline, but from his strength, his ability to lead and protect his people. When Vayne betrayed him, when the council turned against him, it was not just a political maneuver, it was a challenge to the very foundation of our society." "Why did they betray him?" Alara asked. "What did he do that made them turn on him?" Marin was quiet for a moment, her hands continuing their work. "He was too strong," she said finally, "too unwilling to compromise. Vayne and his allies wanted to open the Blackthorn to human expansion, wanted to allow mining operations and lumber camps and settlements. They saw opportunities for wealth and power, but Ronan refused. He knew that allowing humans deeper into our territory would mean the destruction of the forest, the disruption of the old magic that sustains us. He knew it would mean the end of our way of life. So they removed him," Alara said, understanding dawning. "They made him disappear so they could do what they wanted without his interference." "Exactly. And by selling him in the night market, they humiliated him, broke his power, made it clear to all the clans that even the Alpha King could be brought low. It should have worked. By all rights, Ronan should be dead now, or enslaved to some collector who wanted a Lycan trophy." Marin looked up, her eyes meeting Alara's. "But you changed that. You freed him. And in doing so, you changed everything." Alara felt the weight of those words, the implications she was only beginning to understand. "They'll come after me," she said quietly. "Vayne and his allies. They'll see me as a threat." "Oh, child," Marin said with a sad smile. "They'll see you as much more than a threat. They'll see you as the key to controlling Ronan, the weakness they can exploit, the leverage they can use to force him to comply. You are in grave danger, whether you remain at his side or try to flee. The moment you freed him, the moment the bond formed between you, your life became irrevocably tied to this conflict." The fear that Alara had been holding at bay crashed over her in a wave. She had known she was in danger, had known that Vayne would hunt her, but hearing it stated so baldly, understanding that she was now a target not just because of what she had done, but because of what she represented, made it real in a way that sent ice through her veins. "I don't know how to be what he needs," she whispered. "I don't know how to be a mate to a king. I'm nobody. I'm a poor girl from the lower districts who knows how to mix herbs and nothing more. I don't belong in this world." Marin's hand came up to rest gently on Alara's shoulder. "None of us belong anywhere until we claim our place," she said. "You think you are nobody, but Ronan sees you differently. He sees strength and courage and a heart that was willing to act when action meant sacrificing everything. That is not nothing, child. That is everything." Before Alara could respond, the door burst open and Ronan strode in, his face tight with anger and concern. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "Vayne's hunters have been spotted at the border of the settlement. They're moving faster than I anticipated, and they have a tracker with them who knows these woods." His eyes found Alara's. "How quickly can she travel?" Marin had already finished wrapping Alara's feet in clean bandages mixed with her healing poultice. She can walk, but not far and not fast. Her feet need days to heal properly, not hours. Then I'll carry her again. Ronan moved to Alara's side, his hand finding hers automatically. Senna is gathering supplies and weapons. We're heading deeper into the Blackthorn, toward Blackstone Keep by the long route. It will take an extra day, but it's less predictable, harder to track. Ronan, Senna's voice came from the doorway. The silver-haired woman entered, her expression grave. We have a problem. The tracker with Vane's hunters is Maddox. Ronan's entire body went rigid. Maddox, he repeated, and the name came out like a curse. That treacherous snake. I should have killed him when I had the chance. Who is Maddox? Alara asked. A Lycan, Ronan said, his voice hard. One of my own people, or he was until he sold his loyalty to the highest bidder. He knows every path through the Blackthorn, every shortcut and secret way. If he's guiding Vane's hunters, they'll be able to follow us no matter which route we take. Then we need to eliminate him, Senna said flatly. Take him out of the equation before he leads them to us. No, Ronan said. That would require circling back, and we don't have time. We need to focus on reaching Blackstone Keep. Once we're behind those walls, Vane's men cannot touch us without facing the full might of whatever forces remain loyal. And if they catch us before we reach the keep? Senna's question hung in the air like a blade. Ronan's hand tightened on Alara's. Then we fight, and we make them pay dearly for every step they take into Lycan territory. Alara listened to this exchange with growing dread. She had fled the night market thinking that escape meant safety, that once they were free of the city, the danger would diminish. But she was beginning to understand that the danger was just beginning, that she had inserted herself into the middle of a war that had been brewing for years, and that her presence had become a flashpoint that could ignite everything. I could leave, she said quietly, and every eye in the room turned to her. If I'm the one they want, if I'm the leverage they're trying to gain, then maybe I could lead them away from you. Give you time to reach your stronghold and— No. The word was flat, absolute, leaving no room for argument. Ronan's amber eyes burned into hers. You are not bait. You are not a sacrifice. You are my mate, and I will not allow you to throw your life away in some misguided attempt to protect me. Do you understand? The ferocity in his voice, the protectiveness, should have frightened her. But instead, Alara felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that might have been the beginning of trust. I understand, she said. But Ronan, I'm not trained for this. I don't know how to fight or run or survive in this world. I'm going to slow you down. I'm going to be a weakness you can't afford. Ronan knelt before her, bringing his eyes level with hers, and took both her hands in his. Listen to me, he said, his voice softer now but no less intense. You are not weak. You survived in that city for 10 years alone, with no family, no protection, no resources. You learned a trade that helped others, that eased suffering. You walked into the night market, a place that terrifies even hardened criminals, and you bid for a king with everything you owned. You have already proven your strength 100 times over. All that remains is for you to believe it yourself. Tears burned in Alara's eyes, but she blinked them back. I'm scared, she whispered. I'm terrified, Ronan. Of Vane, of this forest, of what's coming. Of you, sometimes. Of what you are, and what that makes me. Good, he said, surprising her. Fear is what keeps us alive. Fear is what makes us careful. But fear does not make you weak, Alara. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. And you have already shown more courage than most warriors I have known. He rose, pulling her to her feet with him. Now come. We have a long journey ahead, and I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Alara looked up at him, at this man who was also a wolf, this king who was also an exile, this stranger who was also somehow the other half of her soul. And she found, to her surprise, that she could. Yes, she said. I trust you. The small smile that curved his lips transformed his face from harsh to almost gentle. Then let's go show Vane and his hunters what happens when they pursue an Alpha King through his own territory. They gathered supplies quickly: food, water skins, warmer clothing for Alara, weapons for Ronan. Senna provided them with a map marked with safe paths and places where they could find shelter if needed. Kira pressed a small bundle into Alara's hands, shy and earnest, containing herbs and bandages, in case the healer needs to heal, she said. And then they were moving again, leaving the settlement behind, plunging deeper into the heart of the Blackthorn. Ronan carried Alara again, his pace swift but sustainable, his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The forest grew darker as they traveled, the canopy above becoming so thick that even midday felt like twilight. The trees here were ancient beyond measure, their trunks scarred with claw marks and strange symbols that Alara could not read, but that seemed to pulse with faint magic. "We're entering the old wood now," Ronan said, his voice low. "The heart of Lycan territory, where the magic is strongest and the old laws hold absolute sway. Humans almost never come here. Even Vane's hunters will be hesitant to follow too deep." "Almost never," Alara repeated. "There have been a few over the centuries. Explorers, hunters seeking legendary beasts, fools who didn't understand what they were walking into. Most never left. Those who did came back changed, marked by the forest in ways that made them no longer quite human." It should have terrified her. Instead, Alara felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. This place, dark and wild and dangerous as it was, felt more like home than Eldergrove ever had. Here, at least, the threats were honest. The forest did not pretend to be something it wasn't, did not smile while planning your destruction. It simply was, in all its terrible beauty. Night fell with the sudden completeness of the deep forest, and Ronan found them shelter in the hollow of a massive tree whose heart had rotted out centuries ago, leaving a space large enough for them to rest. He built a small fire using wood that burned with almost no smoke, and they ate the supplies Senna had provided: dried meat and hard bread and berries that tasted of sunshine and summer, despite the approaching winter. "Tell me about Blackstone Keep," Alara said as they sat by the fire, her feet throbbing despite Marin's poultice, her body aching with exhaustion. "What is it like?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "It's old," he said finally. "Older than Eldergrove, older than any human city in these mountains. It was built by the first Lycan kings using stone quarried from the heart of the Blackthorn and shaped by magic that has been lost for generations. The walls are 30 feet thick in places, and they're carved with wards and protections that make them nearly impregnable. Inside, there are halls and chambers that go down into the mountain itself, deep enough that some levels have never been fully explored." "It sounds incredible," Alara said. "It's a fortress," Ronan replied. "Cold and harsh and designed for war, not comfort. But it's also home. It's where I was born, where I learned to fight and hunt and lead, where my father ruled before his death, and where I claimed my throne." His expression darkened. "Where I was betrayed by those I trusted most." Alara reached out and placed her hand over his, the one that bore her bandages from the night before. "We'll take it back," she said with a confidence she didn't quite feel. "We'll find your loyal people, and we'll take back what was stolen from you." Ronan looked at their joined hands, at the mark that still glowed faintly on her palm, matching the one on his. "You speak as if this is your fight too," he said softly. "Isn't it?" Alara met his eyes. "You said we're bound. You said I'm your mate. Doesn't that mean your enemies are my enemies? Your struggles are mine? It means I will protect you with my life," Ronan said. "It means I will fight every battle to keep you safe. But it doesn't mean you have to fight my wars, Alara. You didn't ask for any of this. I asked for it the moment I bid for you," Alara replied. "I made a choice, Ronan. Maybe fate pushed me toward that choice, but it was still mine to make. And I'm making another choice now. I'm choosing to stand with you. I'm choosing to be part of this, whatever comes." For a long moment, Ronan simply looked at her, and Alara saw something shift in his expression, something that looked like wonder and gratitude, and the beginning of something deeper. Then he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm, right over the mark that bound them. "You are extraordinary," he whispered. "And I am the most fortunate male in existence to have you as my mate." Heat flooded through Alara at his touch, at his words, at the intensity in his eyes. She wanted to say something profound, something that would match the moment, but all she could manage was, "I don't feel extraordinary. I feel terrified and exhausted and completely out of my depth." Ronan's laugh was low and warm. "That's how all great heroes feel, I'm told. Right before they do something impossible and change the world forever." They sat together by the fire as the night deepened around them, and Alara found herself leaning against Ronan's shoulder, his arm coming around her naturally, pulling her close. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, could feel the warmth of his body chasing away the cold of the forest night. And for the first time since her mother died, Alara felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had found, in the most unlikely place and with the most unlikely person, a home. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. Tomorrow they would have to run again, to hide, to fight perhaps. But tonight, in this moment, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the safety of Ronan's arms, Alara allowed herself to simply be, to rest, to hope. Above them, through the opening in the hollow tree, she could see stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds on velvet. And watching them, feeling the bond between her and Ronan thrumming with silver warmth, Alara thought that maybe, just maybe, her life was finally beginning. Part 4. Dawn came slowly to the old wood, the light filtering through the dense canopy in pale, hesitant streams. Alara woke to find herself alone in the hollow tree, the fire reduced to embers, and panic seized her heart before she heard movement outside and saw Ronan returning with fresh water and what looked like fish from a nearby stream. "You're awake," he said, offering her a small smile. "I thought I'd let you sleep as long as possible. We have a hard day ahead." Alara accepted the water gratefully, drinking deeply, then helped prepare the fish for cooking over the rekindled fire. As they ate, Ronan studied the map Senna had provided, his finger tracing possible routes. "We're about halfway to Blackstone Keep," he said. "If we move quickly and encounter no obstacles, we could reach it by nightfall. But Maddox and the hunters are close. I can smell them on the wind, perhaps only a few hours behind us." "Then we should go now," Alara said, forcing herself to her feet despite the pain that lanced through them. The poultice had helped, and the wounds were beginning to heal, but they were far from recovered. Ronan's eyes assessed her with concern. "Can you walk at all today? I don't mind carrying you, but if we need to fight, I'll need my hands free." Alara took a few experimental steps, gritting her teeth against the pain. "I can walk," she said. "Slowly, but I can do it. We'll move faster if you're not burdened with me." They set out into the gray morning, Ronan leading the way along paths that were barely visible, following signs in the forest that only he could read. The trees here were so massive that they created their own weather, moisture dripping from leaves high above, mist collecting in the hollows between roots. Everything was alive with sound, birds calling, small creatures rustling through undergrowth, the distant sound of water running over stone. But there were other sounds too. Behind them, growing gradually closer, the baying of hounds, human voices calling to each other, the crack of branches breaking under careless feet. The hunters were no longer trying to be subtle. They knew they were close, and they were closing in for the kill. "They're pushing hard," Ronan said, his voice tight. "Maddox must have told them we're heading for Blackstone Keep. They're trying to overtake us before we reach the safety of the fortress." "How much farther?" Alara asked, forcing herself to move faster despite the agony in her feet. 6 hours at this pace, maybe 5 if we push. Ronan glanced back the way they had come. "They'll catch us in 3. The implication hung between them like a blade. They would have to fight. There was no avoiding it now. Alara felt fear coil in her stomach, cold and sharp, but she pushed it down. She had survived this long by facing what came without flinching. She would not start flinching now. They walked in tense silence for another hour, the sounds of pursuit growing steadily louder. And then, abruptly, Ronan stopped. He held up a hand, his head tilted, listening to something Alara could not hear. His expression went cold and hard, the face of a warrior preparing for battle. "They've split up," he said. "Maddox is leading one group to flank us, trying to cut off our path to the keep. The main group is still behind us, driving us forward into the trap. What do we do?" Ilara's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own voice. Ronan turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the calculation of a strategist, the ferocity of a predator, and beneath it all, the fierce protectiveness of a mate. "I'm going to draw them away," he said. "Lead them on a chase through the forest while you continue toward Blackstone Keep." "No," Ilara said immediately. "No, we stay together. That's what you said. We face this together." "Ilara, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." She grabbed his arm, forcing him to meet her eyes. "If you go alone, if you try to face all of them by yourself, they will overwhelm you. You're still recovering from the silver and the thornbind. You're not at full strength. And even if you were, Maddox knows how you fight, knows your tactics. He'll be expecting you to try something heroic and stupid like this." Ronan stared at her, and she could see the war in his expression, the instinct to protect her warring with the knowledge that she was right. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked finally. Ilara's mind raced, trying to think through the panic and fear. "You said Maddox is trying to flank us, to cut us off from the keep. What if we let him think he's succeeded? What if we circle around, come at them from an unexpected direction while they're focused on where they think we'll be?" A slow smile spread across Ronan's face. "You have the mind of a tactician, little Omega. That could work. It's risky, but it could work." He pulled the map from his pack and spread it on the ground, pointing to their location and the likely position of their pursuers. "If we move here, through this ravine, we can circle around behind Maddox's group. They'll be watching the main path, expecting us to come that way. We hit them from behind, eliminate them quickly and quietly, then deal with the main group." "Eliminate them," Ilara repeated, the reality of what they were discussing settling over her like a cold fog. "You mean kill them?" Ronan's expression was grave. "These men are here to capture or kill us, Ilara. There will be no mercy, no negotiation. It's survival. Them or us." Ilara thought about that, about the weight of taking a life, even in self-defense. She had spent her entire existence trying to heal, to preserve life where she could. The idea of deliberately ending someone's life made her stomach churn. But she also thought about what would happen if they were captured. Thought about being dragged back to Eldergrove, thrown into Vane's dungeons, tortured for information, or used as leverage against Ronan. Thought about watching Ronan die while she was helpless to prevent it. "Them or us," she repeated quietly. "I understand." They moved quickly through the forest, Ronan leading them down into a ravine where water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. The going was treacherous, the rocks slippery and the current strong enough to pull at their legs, but it also masked their scent and made them nearly impossible to track. They followed the ravine for nearly a mile, Ilara's feet screaming in protest but her will holding firm, until Ronan signaled a stop. "Maddox's group is just ahead," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. 4 hunters, all armed. Maddox himself is the most dangerous. He's Lycan, which means he's fast, strong, and nearly impossible to kill without silver or fire. "Do you have silver?" Ilara asked. Ronan shook his head. "Lost my weapons when I was captured. All I have is what the forest provides, and my own claws and teeth." "And me," Ilara said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "You have me. What can I do to help?" Ronan looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing options, calculating risks. "You stay hidden," he said finally. "Watch from a safe distance. If things go badly, if I fall, you run. You run as fast as you can toward Blackstone Keep, and you don't look back." "I won't leave you." "You will," Ronan said, his voice hard with command. "You will, because if I die, you're the only one who can carry word to my people about Vane's betrayal, about what's really happening. You will because the bond between us means my death will wound you, but it won't kill you, and you can still have a life even without me. Promise me, Ilara. Promise me that if I fall, you'll run." Ilara wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but she saw the desperation in his eyes and knew that this mattered to him more than perhaps anything else. "I promise," she whispered, "but you're not going to fall. We're both going to survive this." Ronan's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in that gesture that was becoming familiar. "You give me strength, little Omega. More than you know." Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was brief but intense, claiming and promising and goodbye all at once. Before Alara could respond, before she could process what had just happened, Ronan pulled away and began to change. The transformation was faster this time, more fluid, and within seconds the man was gone, and the great black wolf stood in his place. The wolf looked at her with those amber eyes that were still recognizably Ronan's, and then it turned and moved silently up out of the ravine toward where the hunters waited. Alara followed, climbing carefully, staying low and hidden behind trees and rocks. She could see them now, 4 men in the dark uniforms of the King's Guard, weapons drawn, scanning the forest ahead of them, and among them, a figure that was clearly not human despite its human shape. Maddox. He was tall and lean, with hair the color of rust and eyes that reflected light like coins. He moved with the predatory grace of a lichen, his attention focused on the path ahead, clearly expecting Ronan to come from that direction. The wolf that was Ronan circled around, silent as shadow, positioning himself behind the group. Alara held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they would hear it. And then Ronan struck. He moved like lightning, like death given form. One moment he was still, the next he had closed the distance to the nearest hunter and his jaws were at the man's throat. There was a brief, choked sound and then silence. The other hunters whirled, weapons coming up, but Ronan was already moving, a blur of black fur and lethal purpose. Maddox shouted something in that language of growls and sounds, and he began to change, his human form melting away to reveal a wolf that was smaller than Ronan, but no less dangerous. Its fur the same rust color as his human hair. The 2 wolves collided with a sound like thunder, teeth and claws seeking purchase, both fighting with the ferocity of creatures who knew that hesitation meant death. The remaining 2 hunters tried to help Maddox, their swords slashing at Ronan, but fighting a lichen in the forest was like fighting the forest itself. Ronan was everywhere and nowhere, moving between the trees with impossible speed, using the terrain to his advantage. One hunter fell to claws that opened his belly before he could even scream. The other managed to land a glancing blow across Ronan's shoulder, drawing blood, before Ronan's jaws closed on his sword arm and crushed bone and steel together. And then it was just Ronan and Maddox, 2 wolves locked in combat that was both beautiful and terrible. They moved in a deadly dance, each anticipating the other's moves. Years of training and instinct guiding their actions. Blood stained the forest floor, though Alara couldn't tell whose. The sounds of snarling and snapping filled the air, punctuated by the impact of bodies against trees and earth. Maddox was good, Alara realized with growing dread. Very good. And Ronan was tired, wounded, not at full strength. As she watched, Maddox managed to get his jaws around Ronan's throat, and panic surged through Alara with such force that she couldn't breathe. No, this couldn't be how it ended. She hadn't come this far, hadn't freed a king and run through the night and faced down her terror, only to watch him die in front of her. Alara looked around desperately for something, anything she could use to help. Her eyes fell on one of the fallen hunters, on the sword that lay near his outstretched hand. Silver, she realized. The blade was silver, made specifically for hunting lichens. She grabbed it, barely managing to lift its weight, and stumbled toward where the 2 wolves fought. "Maddox!" she screamed, her voice shrill with terror and desperation. "Maddox, stop!" The rust-colored wolf's head turned at the sound of her voice, its jaws releasing Ronan's throat just for an instant, just long enough for Ronan to twist free, to put distance between them, just long enough for Alara to close those final few steps and drive the silver sword forward with all her strength into Maddox's exposed side. The wolf let out a sound that was almost human, a scream of agony that echoed through the forest. It staggered, the silver burning through its body like acid, and then it collapsed, its form shimmering and changing as death claimed it, until what lay on the forest floor was a man again, rust-haired and pale, blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him. Alara dropped the sword like it had burned her, staring at what she had done, at the life she had just ended. Her hands were shaking, her whole body was shaking, and she felt bile rise in her throat. She had killed someone. She had taken a life. The weight of it crashed over her like a wave, and she fell to her knees, gasping for air that wouldn't seem to fill her lungs. Warm fur pressed against her side, and then Ronan was there in his human form, pulling her into his arms, holding her as she shook apart. "Breathe," he murmured into her hair. "Just breathe, Alara. You did what had to be done. You saved my life." "I killed him," she whispered. "I killed him, Ronan. You saved me," he repeated firmly. "He would have torn out my throat. Another second and I would have been dead. You acted with courage and decisiveness, and you saved my life. There is no shame in that, no guilt to carry. Do you understand?" Alara wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the absolution he was offering, but she could still feel the resistance of flesh as the blade went in, could still hear that terrible scream. It would haunt her, she knew, perhaps for the rest of her life. But Ronan was alive, warm and solid in her arms, and that had to count for something. That had to matter. "We need to keep moving," Ronan said gently. "The main group will have heard the fighting. They'll be here soon." He helped her to her feet, and Alara forced herself to look away from Maddox's body, from the fallen hunters, from the evidence of the violence that had stained this peaceful forest. Ronan gathered what weapons he could carry. A sword for himself, a knife that he pressed into Alara's hand despite her reluctance. "Just in case," he said. "I won't let you face danger unarmed again." They ran then, exhaustion and pain forgotten in the desperate need to put distance between themselves and the approaching hunters. Behind them, Alara heard shouts of rage and grief as Vane's men discovered what had happened. The hunt intensified, no longer just pursuit but revenge, and she knew that there would be no mercy now if they were caught. The forest began to change as they ran. The trees grew smaller, more sparse, and the ground rose steadily beneath their feet. They were climbing toward the higher mountains, toward the rocky peaks where Blackstone Keep stood, and as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, as shadows grew long and the temperature dropped, Alara saw it. The fortress rose from the mountain like it had been carved from a single piece of stone, its walls black and forbidding, its towers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. It was massive, dwarfing anything Alara had seen in Eldergrove, and it radiated age and power and an implacable strength that seemed to say that it had stood for 1,000 years and would stand for 1,000 more. "Blackstone Keep," Ronan said, and his voice carried a mixture of relief and homecoming and something deeper. "We're almost there, Alara. Just a little farther." But the hunters were close behind them now, close enough that Alara could hear individual voices, could hear the officer commanding them to surround the fleeing pair, to cut them off before they reached the keep. Ronan's pace increased, his hand gripping Alara's tightly, pulling her along even when her legs threatened to give out beneath her. They broke from the tree line into the open ground before the keep, and immediately arrows began to fall around them. Vane's archers, positioned on the high ground, trying to bring them down before they could reach safety. Ronan wrapped himself around Alara, his larger body shielding her, taking hits meant for her. She felt him flinch as an arrow struck his shoulder, another grazing his thigh, but he didn't stop running. The gates of Blackstone Keep loomed before them, massive things of iron-bound wood that looked like they could withstand a siege. And they were closed, sealed shut against all comers. "Open the gates!" Ronan roared, his voice carrying across the open ground with impossible volume. "This is your Alpha King. I command you to open these gates." For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The gates remained closed, and the hunters poured from the forest behind them, weapons raised, victory written on their faces. And Alara understood with sickening clarity that they had run so far, fought so hard, only to die here within sight of safety. But then slowly, with a groan of metal and wood that sounded like the earth itself protesting, the gates began to open. Figures appeared in the widening gap. Lycans in armor, weapons drawn, their eyes reflecting the dying sunlight like flames. And at their head stood a figure Alara recognized from the settlement. Senna, her silver hair braided for battle, a sword in her hand that looked like it had drunk blood in 1,000 wars. "Ronan!" she called. "Run!" They ran. The final yards felt like miles, arrows falling around them like deadly rain, the hunters so close behind that Alara could hear their breathing. She stumbled, her exhausted legs finally giving out, and she would have fallen if Ronan hadn't swept her up into his arms without breaking stride. They crossed the threshold just as the first hunter reached the gates. Senna's sword flashed in the fading light, and the man fell back with a scream. The other Lycans surged forward, driving back the attackers, giving Ronan and Alara the seconds they needed to get inside. "Close the gates!" Senna commanded, and the massive doors swung shut with a boom that shook the ground. Bars fell into place, locks engaged, and suddenly the sounds of battle were muted, distant, happening in another world entirely. Alara and Ronan collapsed onto the stone floor of the courtyard, gasping for breath, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but alive. Alive and safe behind walls that had never been breached in 1,000 years of standing. Senna knelt beside them, her expression tight with concern. "By the old gods, Ronan, what happened out there? We heard you were being pursued, but we didn't know it was half of Vane's army." "Maddox is dead," Ronan said, his breathing labored, "and 4 of Vane's hunters with him. But the rest will lay siege to this place. Vane will not give up, not now. He's committed too much, revealed too much. He has to see this through or lose everything." "Then let him try," Senna said grimly. "These walls have withstood worse than a human lord and his bought mercenaries." She looked at Alara, her pale gold eyes assessing. "You're wounded." Alara looked down at herself and was surprised to see blood. Some of it Ronan's, transferred when he shielded her, but some of it her own. An arrow had grazed her arm without her even noticing. The pain came flooding in now that the immediate danger had passed, along with exhaustion so profound that she could barely keep her eyes open. "See to Alara first," Ronan commanded, trying to stand and swaying with the effort. "Her wounds before mine." "Your wounds are more severe," Alara protested weakly. "I heal faster." Ronan's eyes were already starting to close, consciousness slipping away as the adrenaline that had kept him moving drained from his system. "See to her, Senna. That's an order from your king." And then he collapsed, his massive frame hitting the stone with a sound that made Alara cry out. She tried to crawl to him, but hands held her back, gentle hands but firm, and she heard Senna's voice as if from a great distance saying, "Healers, now! And someone help me get them both to the infirmary before they bleed out on my courtyard stones." The world began to fade, darkness creeping in at the edges of Alara's vision. The last thing she remembered was being lifted, carried through passages carved from living stone, and the distant, desperate hope that Ronan would survive this. That they both would. That the long flight through darkness had finally brought them home. When Alara woke, it was to softness and warmth and the absence of pain. She lay in a bed, an actual bed with sheets and pillows and a weight of furs that pressed down on her like a gentle embrace. The room around her was carved from dark stone, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Tapestries hung from the ceiling, depicting scenes of wolves and forests and kings in battle. "You're awake." The voice came from beside the bed, and Alara turned her head to see Senna sitting in a chair, her expression unreadable. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. We weren't sure you would wake." 2 days? Alara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her body. "Ronan, where is Ronan? Is he alive?" Senna said quickly. "Wounded, but alive and healing. He's been in here every hour asking about you, refusing to rest properly until he knew you were going to be all right." Something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "He's quite devoted to you, our king. The mate bond has him well and truly caught." Relief flooded through Alara so intensely that tears sprang to her eyes. "Can I see him?" "Soon. First, you need to eat and regain your strength. The healers say you are on the verge of complete collapse, exhaustion, blood loss. shock from having taken a life. It's a wonder you made it here at all. Alara looked down at her hands, remembering the feeling of the sword going in, the terrible weight of having killed. I didn't have a choice, she said quietly. No, Senna agreed. You didn't. And you shouldn't have had to make that choice at all. You're what, 22? 23? You should have been living a peaceful life, perhaps married to some decent craftsman, raising children and growing old without ever knowing the weight of taking a life. Instead, you freed a king and became embroiled in a war that should never have been yours to fight. She leaned forward, her pale eyes intense. I won't pretend to understand fate, Alara Whitlow. I don't know why the mate bond chose you for Ronan, why a poor human herbalist from Elder Grove slums was marked as the partner to the Alpha King. But I do know this. You have proven yourself worthy of that bond 100 times over. What you did in that forest, killing Maddox to save Ronan's life, took a courage that few warriors possess. It doesn't feel like courage, Alara whispered. It feels like horror. Yes, Senna said simply. It does. And it will for a long time. That's how you know you're still human, still possessed of the compassion that makes life worth protecting. The day you can kill without feeling horror is the day you've lost something essential. She stood, moving to a table where a tray of food waited. Now eat. Ronan will be here soon, and he'll want to see you properly fed and recovered. Alara ate mechanically. Bread and cheese and meat that tasted of smoke. Fruits she didn't recognize but that burst with sweetness on her tongue. As she ate, Senna filled her in on what had happened during her unconsciousness. Vane's forces had established a siege around Blackstone Keep, cutting off all access in or out. But they were hesitant to attack directly, knowing that the fortress had never been taken by force, and that the Lycans inside could hold indefinitely. It was a stalemate, with each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. Ronan is calling a council, Senna said. All the clan leaders who remain loyal will gather here to decide our next move. Some want to sally forth and drive Vane's forces away. Others counsel patience, waiting for winter to weaken the siege. But all agree on one thing. Vane's betrayal cannot stand. He has violated every treaty and agreement that has kept peace between humans and Lycans for centuries. Blood must answer for blood. Before Alara could respond, the door opened and Ronan entered. He looked better than he had when they had arrived. The wounds were healing, the exhaustion less pronounced, but there were still shadows under his eyes and a tightness to his movements that spoke of lingering pain. But when he saw Alara sitting up in bed, his face transformed, relief and joy washing over his features with such intensity that it took her breath away. Alara, he breathed, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside the bed, taking her hands in his, pressing them to his lips and then his forehead in a gesture of such devotion that Alara felt tears spring to her eyes again. Thank the old gods. I thought, when you collapsed, when you wouldn't wake, I thought I had lost you. I'm here, Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm all right, Ronan. We made it. We're safe. For now, he said, but his smile belied the grimness of the words. For now, we're safe. And together. And that's all that matters. He looked at Senna. Give us a moment? Senna nodded and left without a word, closing the door quietly behind her. Alone with Ronan, Alara felt the weight of everything they had endured crash over her. The fear, the violence, the desperate flight through the forest. And beneath it all, the bond between them, stronger now than ever, humming with a connection that went beyond words or touch. I killed someone, she said quietly. I took a life, Ronan. I drove that sword into Maddox and I watched him die. I know, Ronan said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. And I know what that costs. I know the weight you're carrying. But Alara, listen to me. You saved my life. You acted when action was needed, and you proved that you have the strength and courage to do what must be done to protect those you care about. There is no shame in that. Only honor. It doesn't feel honorable, Alara whispered. It feels terrible. Yes, Ronan agreed. It does. And that's as it should be. The day taking a life becomes easy is the day we lose our humanity, or our compassion. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "We will carry this weight together, Ilara. Your burden is mine, and mine is yours. That's what the bond means. That's what being mates means. You are not alone in this pain." And somehow, hearing that, knowing that she didn't have to carry this horror by herself, made it bearable. Not easy, not light, but bearable. Ilara closed her eyes and let herself lean into Ronan's strength, let herself draw comfort from his presence and his words. They stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing together, existing in the quiet space beyond words. And then Ronan pulled back slightly, his amber eyes searching her face. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Something you should know before the council meets." "What is it?" "The bond between us, the mate bond, can be completed or it can remain as it is. A connection of souls, but not of bodies. In Lycan culture, the completion is a choice, made when both parties are ready and willing. I want you to know that I will never pressure you, never demand that completion from you. You have already given me so much. Your courage, your loyalty, your very life has been upended because of me. I will not ask for more than you are willing to give." Ilara looked at him, at this man who was also a wolf, this king who knelt before her like a supplicant, this being who had the power to command armies but who was offering her choice, offering her control over her own body and fate. And she realized that somewhere in the chaos of the past days, somewhere between the night market and the forest, and the desperate race to Blackstone Keep, she had fallen in love with him. "Ronan," she said softly, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we'll survive this war with Vayne, if we'll be able to reclaim your throne and bring peace to these lands. But I know that I choose you. I choose this bond. And I choose whatever comes with it. Not because fate decreed it, but because I want to. Because you have shown me more kindness and respect and care in a few days than I received in all my years in Eldergrove. Because when I look at you, I see home." The kiss that followed was different from the brief, desperate one in the forest. This was slow and deep and full of promise, a claiming and a surrender all at once. And as their lips met, as the bond between them sang with completion and joy, Ilara knew that whatever came next, whatever battles they had to fight or hardships they had to endure, they would face them together. And that made all the difference.